Are you playing the right race for your class? Does it matter? What's more important? Numbers, utility, fantasy, or transmog? Either way, if you have ever wanted to play a degenerate class race combo and flex your 0.5% extra DPS, then this is the video for you. Disclaimer, so we don't lose any more subs on YouTube because of our ideas. Young_Twizzler1199. Here I thought we would be in for the long haul, but damn, sad face. Oh, me sad face. Every expansion or even patch, people sim the ratios for each spec on websites like bloodmallet.com to figure out the exact throughput gains that races provide. You could visit these websites and keep tabs on the latest calculations done, but there are a few issues here. First of all, it is based on character profiles and templates, which will not accurately reflect your character with your gear and definitely not your skill. 2. The type of sims done give different results based on the type of fight. For instance, for Frost Mage on a casting patchwork single target style fight, Tauren is the best, but if you go to 3 targets, Dwarf wins out. So which is it? Will you swap races every raid boss? You will legit drown Blizz in your money. They will ask you to take some of it back because it's just so much money now. Third issue is these sims do not take into account a lot of context that can change your opinion. Stuff like how Taurens have an AoE stun that can be very good on classes with no AoE stun, or how dwarfs can clear bleeds, poisons, diseases and curses, which can be a lifesaver for Mythic Plus pusher that gets to keys level so high where one bleed can destroy a tank. So using stuff like Stoneform or Fireblood will essentially act as an extra defensive cooldown. Some of these race class combo results look like a grandma trying to cosplay a hot anime chick at a convention, and when you put the two together you get... Nope, not gonna do that to you, nope. Fifth, sometimes specs can change their desired stat priority, moving away from elves that usually give crit to maybe gnomes that give haste and so on. And lastly, the differences are so minor in terms of DPS and HPS gain that incorporating this as a requirement for someone to play is asinine, but people still like to flex it, so let's flex it. What if you could have the best race for your class all around? How would that look like? Well, we can do this from 3 main points of view and then draw like one big conclusion at the end. The first is damage and healing, but healers are not real and nobody cares, so this section has to be named damage so DPS brains don't get confused by other more accurate definitions like throughput. The second criteria worth ranking races by would be the utility they provide, like CC breaks, toughness, through versatility or magic resistance, etc. The last one would be flavor. Flavor in terms of aesthetics, but flavor in terms of lore as well. This last one is giga subjective and mostly a fun criteria from my point of view, but feel free to chime in the comments. Starting with the Demon Hunter, the options are obviously limited, with Havoc preferring Blood Elf as its best race, with Night Elf being secondary, while Vengeance is vice versa. I will take a guess here, and with all the other races and class combos, that the reason for this ranking is because of the stat ratios. Blood Elves give you 1% crits, while Night Elves cycle between 1% crit and 1% haste. Vengeance usually likes haste a lot more, as with most tanks, and there are times when Havoc likes haste a lot. As it stands, either of the two races can work in terms of throughput. The tiebreaker can be their active ratios. Blood Elves can do an AoE purge on top of the already existing single target purge that Demon Hunters come equipped with. This makes it a little redundant and definitely less valuable. Night Elves have the famous Shadow Meld, which is a vanish style ability that makes you invisible and drops combat. This is actually really strong, but also really niche. I guess both racials have proper strength and uses for their utility, so I really cannot see one win over the other, which means we go to the second tiebreaker, the flavor. Here I will give it to Night Elves since they are obviously lore accurate, but the Demon Hunter armor just looks way better on them, so aesthetic wise, they win over Blood Elves. Winner, Night Elf. While we are at it, consider checking our second channel, especially good if you miss seeing Marcelian's face, since our second channel has videos and clips from our weekly WoW wrap-up show where we talk about the happenings in WoW while constantly arguing about balanced Druid, the suspension of disbelief, and how much character build-up Xal'atath has had since BFA. Plus, of course, a lot more stuff. So hop on over from the link below and see if more raw and unfiltered Marcelian Online is your jam. Since the peanut butter is Death Knight, haha. Unholy is, spoiler alert, the only spec in the game that has Troll as a race simming the best in single target, of course, because we won't be doing this for every fight style or I will lose my mind, more than I already have. The next best race is Human, most likely because of the Human Spirit racial that gives 2% extra secondary stats from all sources. This is the most balanced throughput gain that can work on every class that values secondaries more or less in equal manner, which is why Human is the best race for both Frost and Blood Decay. The second best race for these would be Tauren for Blood and Blood Elf for Frost. Tauren is likely good because it comes with 2% crit damage and healing, and you heal yourself and damage others, but the damage is likely valuable more. Not to mention that it comes with an AoE stun, which Death Knight doesn't have, and I think is the only race that gives you a stamina boost, which is something that Blood really likes, while Frost likely wants Blood Elf for the crit chance, since historically crit has been incredible for it. And by majority rule, the winner for Death Knight is Human! Druid is a bit simpler despite it having 4 specs, so let's look at all at the same time, in the interest of time as well. Outside balance, all specs really love Tauren the most. Once again, and I won't keep saying this by the way, Tauren comes with Brawn that gives 2% crit damage and crit healing, and to be fair, War Stomp is an amazing ability on Druid since it lets you pick Demoralizing Roar without any guilt of leaving Bash behind. Balance wants Night Elf for Touch of a Loon most likely, which cycles through haste and crit, while the secondary races for Druid are actually reversed, with Balance going for Tauren and the rest for Night Elf. Once again, this is pure throughput, so War Stomp isn't actually calculated. If we put War Stomp on the table, that makes Tauren a clear winner. In terms of flavor though, Night Elf wins in my opinion, which is why my Druid is also a Night Elf. Elusiveness is really cool, and obviously only Druids and Rogues, maybe Hunters, can benefit from it. Plus, almost no gear looks good on Tauren if you play Resto or Glyph of Stars, so that's another minus. My personal bias aside, the winner is clearly still Tauren from a practical point of view. Hunter is a class that very often favors Dwarf because of the Might of the Mountain giving them extra 2% crit damage and healing, similar to Tauren? Now that is the confusing part, since that Tauren does the exact same with Brawn, and there are no other differentiating factors in terms of damage that separate the two that I can notice, unless I've missed something. And yet for some reason, Marksmanship and Survival favor Dwarf while Beast Mastery favors Tauren. Normally this would be fine if it would be like Druid where their secondary best race is the reverse, but it's not. Well, for BM it is, but for the other two, Human reigns higher. This is once again to prove how close and kind of pointless this is. But at the end of the day, more damage is more damage. Not to mention that if you had to choose between all of these, you might once again come down to the active racials or flavor. Dwarves have Stoneform, which is incredibly good at removing super dangerous debuffs and making you tankier. The stun from Tauren is melee, and although not impossible to use for Beast Mastery and Marksmanship, Survival benefits from it way more, of course. While Human just gives more secondary stats and the stun removal. Numbers wise, the winner is clearly Dwarf, and it wins out in flavor as well, which is why I have it as my race of choice for Hunter. Dwarves with guns are just really cool. Mages are a mixed bag. Note that in the War Within, funky stuff is happening with Mage, and I just happen to know it since I main it. Funky stuff like Mechanomes being a good race temporarily, which is not something I will take into consideration, but worth mentioning, again, to show that things are more malleable than you might believe. First of all, the best race for each spec differs, and as of recording this video, Arcane wants Human, Fire wants Dwarf, and Frost wants Tauren. Again, Tauren and Dwarf give the same exact amount of throughput, so the fact that it is like this is funny, since their secondary races are the reverse, with Arcane getting no. Gnome has been historically good for Arcane because of the increase in mana, but also the 1% haste. Mana is kind of whatever now, which is why Human wins out. But maybe not whatever enough, since we could have had any other race as the second best, but we got Gnome still. The ratios are not enough to tie break the races, since Arcane is just eating a totally different pie, and I hope I don't have to do this for any other class, but the third best race for both Fire and Frost is also Human, making Human the likely best race for mages as a whole. Sure, individual specs want different stuff, but since we want to know the best race for the class and not the spec, the winner is Human. Monk will be fun, you guys, so check this out. Windwalker likes Void Elf. How about that? Entropic Embrace is a racial that makes your abilities have a chance to deal 5% extra damage as Shadow Frost as a 12-second dot. Windwalker has been using crit and verse stats since forever, and these are the stats you usually want when you want your damage procs, trinkets, weapons, or in this case, racials, to do extra damage. Mistweaver likes Night Elf the best, with Brewmaster wanting Dwarf. Mistweaver is mostly a guess on my part based on Touch of a Loon, but also the fact that the top Mistweavers in the game are playing almost all Night Elves. That could be also unrelated, because Night Elves are pretty and all Mistweavers seem to play some version of Elf. Hence why the second best race for Mistweaver is Blood Elf. Crit and Haste are stats Mistweaver likes a lot, and these races bring them in. Brewmaster unsurprisingly likes Tauren second. Taurens also give extra stamina, something that Brewmaster is famously low on and benefits a lot from. But Dwarfs also give Stoneform, which is one of the best racials for tanks in the game currently, if not the best. Windwalker also likes Tauren as a second race, since once again it uses crit a lot. After the rework it received in the War Within, I wouldn't be surprised if Windwalker will prefer haste more than in the past. If that's the case, we might see stuff like Night Elf or Gnome make a cameo, but that's for the future. As such, by majority rule, Tauren wins out for Monk. Again, although Mistweaver doesn't like Tauren as much as the other two, the crit damage and healing can be very beneficial, since it's likely you will always want crit as a stat. Paladin is next on the list, and oh my god, there it is again, Dwarf and Tauren. Well, at least for Holy and Prot, while Red wants Human. And you may look at this and say, well, at least Red doesn't want beef. But oh, it does, it so does, since the second best race is indeed beefy, with the other two swapping options. I gotta say, if we end up doing an overall best race in WoW, it might be obvious so far who is in the lead. And much to my and Marcelian's dismay, Tauren is clearly the best Paladin race across the board. Extra crit damage and healing, extra stamina, AoE stun, hard to pass on the juices as much as I love Dark Iron Dwarf. A winner is a winner. And hey, you, the viewer, can you guess what race Shadow Priest likes the most? Well, it's Human. You thought I was gonna say Tauren, didn't you? Didn't you? Well, that's fine, because Holy still gets the horns, since you really want crit right about now. Honestly, most healers value crit a lot, since haste is a peculiar stat. Haste doesn't make your heals stronger, just faster, so you end up casting more, getting into mana issues, at least for some healers. Not for Discipline though, actually also for Discipline, but Discipline just loves haste, most likely since you end up doing a lot of damage a lot of the time in very tight windows, where every extra global you cast can be worth a lot. That's why I think Night Elf is the best for Discipline, since it also cycles into crit. But a more spicy race as the second best, or best in some players' eyes, is Gnome. You get 1% haste from Gnome, which is true for other races as well, but you also get 5% extra mana with Expansive Mind. Now, mana is a metric for player skill. The better you are at your healer, the less mana issues you will encounter. But mana issues still scale with content difficulty, where your skill can be offset by how high you push or how much people fuck up, making you waste a lot more mana than you intend. We can say this for a lot of healers, of course, but for now we will stick to Discipline. The other choice for Holy will be Blood Elf, in my opinion. 1% crit is self-explanatory, since you like crit, and that can be said for Worgen as well, which also provide crit, but Blood Elf comprises 99% of the healer community. So clearly I am missing something here. All while Shadow wants Void Elf as its second best race. The sheer fact that Void Elf is not the first choice for Shadow should clearly dispel any remaining notions that races matter for your class. How? Why? Because Void Elf and Shadow. I mean, you get it. But as it stands, holy shit, no clue on which one is the winner. I feel like it will come down to the healing specs since Shadow is fairly set in stone, as much as this whole topic is, and out of all of these, I have to go with Human, a generic buff with human spirit for a generic race. If you would have to replace the races from Disc and Holy, Human is likely the safest choice across the board since it will do good no matter what stat priority ends up being the best. Rogue is also fairly diverse, with Assassination preferring Human, Outlaw going for Dwarf, and Subtlety going for Void Elf as of this video. Human and Dwarf are straightforward, but I have to imagine Sub wants Void Elf because the racial with Void Elf might scale with the Capstone Dark Brew and likely similar effects. Once again, the differences are small, but they still exist. It also is a nice flavor. If there's any other spec Void Elf would make sense for, fantasy-wise, outside Shadow Priest, Sub is next in line. Point to be made here, which applies likely to the rest of the classes as well, all of the data we are basing this video off of is Dragonflight data. Since the War Within just started, no public info is out just yet. That means a bunch of these can change. As it stands, I am chatting with some theory crafters and Orc is picking up steam for Sub. We might have to revisit this once the season starts and we'll have data on all of the specs. As for the second best race choice for these, right now is Troll for Assassination, Tauren for Outlaw, and to nobody's surprise, Human for Sub, with a clear winner across the board being Human. Warning: Shaman is yet another boring one with mainly Taurens and Dwarfs across the board, so something like this. Shaman is a class that likes crit, although enhancement mainly wants haste and verse. That doesn't mean that crit damage and healing is not important and stands to point out how good Taurens and Dwarfs are as races. Since we need a tiebreaker, although Tauren seems to win out, I will actually give it to the Dwarfs here, since the benefits to damage is the same, where the differences might come all to the racials, and Shamans already have an AoE stun, making War Stomp less valuable. Stormform, with the amount of dispels needed this expansion, will be a better overall racial. Similar to Rogue, there are other races that are simming better now with preliminary data, but since the season hasn't started and these numbers are not 100% verified or confirmed or accepted, also not for all of the specs, we will keep using Dragonfly numbers for now. Warlock is in a similar situation with Mage, where Affliction likes Human first and Nightborn second, while the other two are a toss-up between Tauren and Dwarfs. I didn't mention this yet, but Nightborn comes with Magical Affinity, which gives you 1% extra magic damage. Obviously, pretty good, while the other contenders have been already dissected too much. Since breaking this tie is annoying again, I will look at the third best choice for the race here, and Affliction will drop to Tauren, while the other two actually favor Human. With this in mind, averaging it out, we end up with Tauren as the winner once again. Yay for the beef! Last but not least is Warrior, and actually the easiest since all three specs want Human as their main race. Their secondary choice ranges from Dwarf for arms, Tauren for fury, and Gnome for protection. And yes, the only reason I mention these is to say that Protection Warrior Gnome is better than Tauren, which I find hilarious. Well, Tauren and even Dwarfs are likely way tankier, but since Prot Warrior can never get enough haste, Gnome makes a lot of sense. But clearly the winner will be Human. These numbers will likely change as the season rolls out more and we have more data. And even if they do, the differences between races is usually around 0.3% if you play perfectly, with the top and bottom being around 2% apart, which is a tiny difference in performance when missing a global, dodging a badly placed puddle, being dispelled too late, and so on will end up causing you to lose much more damage than just the 0.3% or even 2. As a bonus, outside these races being purely good for numbers, there are other races people choose to make sure they perform the best. I mentioned Dwarf a lot, but Stormform is undeniably strong for tanks. A good amount of mechanics that usually kill tanks will be bleeds and strong dots. Removing these and getting 10% physical damage reduction is the strongest racial that can keep tanks alive. Second might actually be Fireblood from Dark Iron Dwarfs, which does the same thing, but instead of the physical damage reduction, you get a main stat buff. This of course gives you more damage. However, as opposed to Dwarfs, you no longer get the 2% crit damage and healing buff. Taurens once again are really good for the AoE stun. I cannot tell you how many times this saved my group when used on a Guardian Druid or a Resto Druid, essentially a class with no AoE stun. Night Elves are the best race at soloing content and surviving shit situations in dungeons and raids with Shadow Meld. You can GTFO when trouble starts, immune certain mechanics or dodge casts, and being faster in stealth doesn't hurt either. Pandaren are some of the most underappreciated race. Not only do you get double buff from food as your throughput ratio, but you are also bouncy. What does that mean? Well, it means you take reduced damage from falling, which happens in a lot of raid mechanics, but also dungeons make falling damage as a mandatory raid gimmick not actually affect you anymore. Last but not least, Goblin comes with the infamous Rocket Jump, being the most skilled racial in the game. You can actually avoid stuff like being pushed off the platform if you time and aim this right. Plus, they have 1% haste, similar to gnomes. Drakthir can only be evokers at the moment until they get warriors, so see you then! There are actually a lot of fun racials that can change the game you play if you use them right, and going for the damage is not always the best thing. Picking racials that boost professions can be fun, if that is your jam. Nightborn have access to mailboxes, Vulperas create camps they can teleport to, High Mountain Torrents can charge, and so on. Don't let sims or a list dictate your fun. Enjoy WoW and our content, since that's the second best thing obviously, by also watching this video we made on add-ons. There is more to the game than add-ons that boost your damage, and some in this list I bet you definitely never heard of.